In 1940, an elderly man in Flint, Michigan opened a small bowling alley across the street from a church with a hot dog stand attached to the side of it. He was in his late 70s. He had almost no money of his own left, and the friends helping him keep the lights on were men who used to work for him. This same man had founded General Motors. Twice, he built it from nothing into one of the largest companies on earth. And twice, he lost control of it, until there was nothing left but a bowling alley and a stroke that ended even that. His name was William Crapo Durant. And if you've never heard it, that is exactly the point of this story. The rise. Durant wasn't an engineer, and he wasn't a car guy, not at first. He was born in Boston in 1861, the grandson of a Michigan lumber baron and former governor. And by the time he was a teenager, his family had moved to Flint, Michigan. He dropped out of high school. He worked odd jobs, including a stretch selling cigars, before landing at his grandfather's lumberyard. None of it looked like the beginning of an empire. Then, in 1885, Durant found the thing he was actually good at, which wasn't building anything. It was selling it, and organizing the sale of it at a scale nobody else in Flint was attempting. He partnered with a man named Josiah Dallas Dort to start the Flint Road Cart Company, making horse-drawn carriages. And by 1890, it had grown into the largest carriage manufacturer in the entire country, turning out some close to 50,000 vehicles a year. Durant had never built a carriage in his life. What he had was a genius for taking a small regional operation and scaling it into a national one almost overnight. In 1904, a struggling automaker named James Whiting convinced Durant to take over the Buick Motor Company, a business that was at the time barely surviving. It was the same trick all over again, but this time with an engine attached. Within 4 years, Durant had turned Buick into the best-selling car company in America. He didn't do it by inventing a better engine. He did it the way he'd done everything else, through aggressive expansion, financing, and sheer force of salesmanship. And then, in 1908, Durant did something far bigger than build one company. He founded General Motors as a holding company and moved fast, buying Buick with stock, then acquiring the Olds Motor Works, then Oakland, which would later become Pontiac, then Cadillac, purchased outright with cash. In barely 2 years, Durant had assembled several of the biggest names in the American auto industry under a single corporate umbrella. He wasn't building cars. He was building a machine that swallowed car companies whole, and doing it at a speed that terrified the conservative bankers of his era. Ask yourself what that kind of speed usually costs, because in Durant's case, it cost him control of the very company he'd just built. The monuments, or rather, the acquisitions. Here's where Durant's story splits from every other fortune in this series. He didn't build palaces. He didn't buy titles or yachts. His monuments were companies, bought one after another, financed with borrowed money and traded stock, at a pace that had almost nothing to do with whether General Motors could actually afford what it was buying. By 1910, General Motors was in serious financial trouble, not because the cars weren't selling, but because Durant had expanded so fast and financed so much of it on credit that the company couldn't cover its own obligations. A group of bankers stepped in to bail out the company, and as their price for the rescue, they forced Durant out of the very corporation he had founded just 2 years earlier. The man who built General Motors was no longer allowed to run it. Most people would have called that the end of the story. Durant treated it as a starting gun. He teamed up with a race car driver and engineer named Louis Chevrolet, and together they built the Chevrolet Motor Company from scratch. And then Durant did something almost nobody expected, and almost nobody would dare attempt today. He used Chevrolet, the smaller company, to quietly buy up shares of General Motors, the giant that had just kicked him out. By 1915, Chevrolet had acquired enough GM stock that Durant walked back into General Motors, not as an employee this time, but as the man back in charge. Think about what means. He was fired from the company he founded, so he built a second company specifically to buy his way back into the first one. It's one of the most audacious comebacks in American business history. It's also, in hindsight, proof of exactly the trait that would eventually finish him off. Durant didn't believe in stopping, slowing down, or building anything conservatively. He believed in moving fast, financing aggressively, and betting on tomorrow's growth to cover today's debt. It had worked spectacularly twice already. It was about to fail him one final time, and this time there would be no way back in. The ism. Here's the principle underneath everything that happened to William Durant, and it's a different mechanism than the ones that sank the Vanderbilts or the Astors. Those families converted working fortunes into static monuments, houses and titles that only cost money. Durant did something closer to the opposite. He never stopped building. He never stopped reinvesting. His problem wasn't that he let a fortune sit still. It's that he ran the entire operation, personally and corporately, on leverage, on borrowed money and margin debt, at a scale turn in the market could wipe out everything at once. Picture it like a man walking a tightrope stretched higher and higher with every year that passes, and instead of ever stepping down to solid ground, he just keeps adding more weight to his own shoulders, certain that his balance will always hold. For a long time, Durant's balance did hold. He had an extraordinary eye for which small companies would become big ones, and he was usually right. But leverage doesn't care how right you've been in the past. It only cares whether you can cover the debt the moment the market turns against you, and eventually the market did. The fall. In the years after retaking General Motors in 15, Durant expanded and company enormously, and by most accounts came personally one of the wealthiest men in the country, heavily invested not just in GM stock but in the stock market itself, buying shares on margin, which meant borrowing heavily against the value of stock he already owned. It's a strategy that magnifies gains on the way up. It also magnifies losses on the way down, and in 1920, the market turned sharply against him. As stock prices fell that year, Durant's personal margin debts came due, and he did not have the cash to cover them. He lost a fortune reported in the hundreds of millions in the collapse, and for the second time, GM's own board and its bankers forced him out of the company entirely, this time for good. He walked away from General Motors in late 1920 with essentially nothing, the very corporation that would go on to become, for much of the 20th century, the largest industrial company on the planet. 6 weeks later, in early 1921, Durant was already raising money. Durant Motors, pulling together several $1 million from banking friends and colleagues to start over completely from scratch. For a while, actually worked. Durant Motors built and sold real cars under several brand names and found genuine, if modest, success through the 1920s. But Durant hadn't changed his instincts. He kept speculating heavily on Wall Street, even running the new company, earning the nickname Bull of the Bulls for his aggressive market bets. And when the stock market crashed in 1929, it hit him from two directions at once, wiping out his personal fortune again and dragging his new car company down with it. Durant Motors ceased production in 1931 and was fully liquidated by 1933. Durant declared personal bankruptcy in 1936, at the age of around 75, a man who had twice built and lost control of what would become the world's largest company. And then, rather than disappear quietly, he did the thing that makes this story land the way it does. In 1940, at nearly 80 years old, Durant opened a bowling alley called the North Flint Recreation Center in an old trucking depot near one of GM's own Buick plants, telling doubters it would be family-friendly bowling with no alcohol served, right across the street from a church. He attached a small drive-in restaurant to it, one of the earliest fast food-style operations in the country, and he genuinely believed he could build it into a nationwide chain. He knelt the chance. A stroke in 1942 ended those plans for good, and Durant spent his final years in a New York apartment, financially dependent on old friends and former colleagues, including Walter Chrysler and GM's own longtime chief executive Alfred P. Sloan, who quietly helped cover his expenses. William Crapo Durant died in March 1927 at 85 years old, the founder of a company that, by then, employed hundreds of thousands of people and was on its way to becoming the largest industrial corporation the world had ever seen. He didn't own a meaningful share of it. He was, by most accounts, essentially broke. The contrast. So what would it have taken for Durant to keep what he built? The answer sits inside the very company he founded, run by the man who replaced him. After Durant's second and final ouster in 1920, General Motors' board turned to a quiet, methodical engineer named Alfred P. Sloan. Sloan did almost the exact opposite of everything Durant had done. Where Durant ran GM by instinct, personal conviction, and constant expansion financed on debt, Sloan built formal management structures, financial controls, and a decentralized system where each GM brand, Buick, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, operated with real accountability to a central financial authority that actually tracked what the company could afford. It was unglamorous, bureaucratic, exactly the kind of structure Durant had never bothered to build. And under Sloan, GM became the largest company in the world for decades, precisely because it no longer depended on any single individual's gut instinct or personal borrowing capacity to survive. You can see the same lesson in a completely different family from this same era. The DuPont family, who had actually been major investors in General Motors during Durant's second tenure, ran their own core chemical business through exactly the kind of professional, institutional structure GM lacked under Durant, and management kept separate financial discipline enforced, whose job was specifically to say no. It's the same principle that saved the Rockefeller fortune and the same one that could have saved the Vanderbilts. An individual, however brilliant, is a single point of failure. A structure run by people accountable to something bigger than one person's ambition survives the mistakes any one person is bound to make eventually. Durant was arguably a more visionary founder than Sloan ever was. He saw the potential of the automobile industry earlier and more clearly than almost anyone alive at the time. And the company he founded became a 100-year success story only after it stopped being run the way he ran it. The lesson. Here's the lesson sitting underneath William Durant's entire career, and it's a different one than we've seen so far in this series. It's not about splitting a fortune among too many heirs, and it's not about converting money into monuments that only cost. It's about the danger of never building a wall between your own personal risk-taking and the fate of everything you've built. Durant never separated his own leveraged bets from the company's survival. Twice and twice it cost him everything. Vision's empire. Structure is the only thing that keeps it standing after the visionary's luck finally runs out, and everyone's luck eventually does. The callback. Picture that bowling alley again, in Flint, Michigan, 1940. An 80-year-old man in a modest coat, standing behind the counter of a business he built with borrowed money and sheer stubbornness, a few miles from the enormous factories still running under the name he gave them. General Motors was, by then, already one of the largest companies on Earth. The man who founded it was hoping a chain of bowling alleys might turn things around one more time. The Fanger. But Durant at least died in his own bed, in his own city, with old friends still willing to help him. There's one more story in this genre, and it's the strangest of them all, because it isn't about a family or a founder losing a fortune slowly. It's about an entire company worth billions that collapsed in a matter of weeks, brought down not by bad luck or the market, but by a fraud so audacious that prosecutors are still studying it as the textbook case decades later. That story is next.